Okay, picking up with Paradise Canto 11. Let's see here. Dante's in the heaven of the sun, and I want to pick up, I think, a page 150. Yeah. 150, the top of the page, beginning around line 28 or so. The providence whose rule and sway devolve worldwide, and whose unfathomed counsels shroud a mystery no created sight can solve, mindful of her, that is the church, whose bridegroom, that is Christ, crying loud with his own sacred blood, espoused her, that she to her delight might pass endowed with more self-certainty and livelier faith in her Lord, did at her court install a prince on either hand for counselor. Okay, so he's saying the church installed a counselor on either side. And that's because two leaders, let's say, two luminaries of the church are going to be referred to. Right? One of the two was in his ardor, which is another word for love, all seraphic, one in knowledge, was on earth the splendor of the light, cherubical. So the one who in his ardor was all seraphic, that's referring to St. Francis, and the one who was in knowledge, cherubical, that's St. Dominic. So you got St. Francis, founder of the Franciscans, and Dominic, founder of the Dominican monks. Two of the four orders of monks, okay? And what we're going to hear in this canto is St. Francis, we're going to hear St. Thomas talk about, or espouse, if you want, St. Francis. And then in the next canto, we're going to hear a follower of St. Francis espouse or praise St. Dominic, okay? So you get down to the bottom of that page, 150, and we hear about St. Francis's background. You know, he earned his father's displeasure because he gave everything up for poverty's sake, and that's the lady that is referred to in line 59. Yet young his father's stern displeasure for a lady's sake, that's poverty, to whom as unto death no man is eager to unbar the door, etc., etc. Line 64, she, Lady Poverty, or poverty, just poverty, of her first spouse widow, her first spouse being Christ, because Christ died, had lived through obscure and scorn 12 centuries or near with never a lover till he came to woo. And what Dante is suggesting here is nobody properly followed poverty since Christ. Remember, Christ, we're told in the Gospels, says that the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, but rather he's like a fox who lives in a den, etc., travels from place to place. Well, what are Christians called to do? Christ tells the rich young man, go sell all that you have and come and follow me. He tells another, you can't keep your hand at the plow and look backwards. And then he goes on and says, you cannot serve two masters, God and mammon. Mammon, Aramaic word for wealth or money. What he's suggesting here is that for 1,200 years, Christians haven't been following Christ's example, okay? So he says, not it availed that she so constant was, line 70, and so courageous that when Mary stayed below, she stepped with Christ upon the cross. Well, how did poverty step with Christ upon the cross? What did Christ take with him when he ascended on the cross? Nothing. Literally nothing. He was naked when he was nailed to the cross. And what we see in the image of Christ on the cross is, according to traditional Christian theology, is the second person of the Trinity who has become fully man, so fully God and fully man, does what when he's nailed to the cross? He totally self-empties. That is, he totally denies himself in who he is. The Greek word that is used to describe that is kenosis. Okay, it's this giving up of everything. He totally denies, essentially, who he is. Notice, he's told from the people on the ground, if you are the Christ, get up off the cross. If you are the Christ, show us your angelic hosts, etc., etc. And by not doing any of those things, what's he doing? It's not that he's denying that he is the Christ. It's he's denying himself the power, the glory, all those kinds of things. He's showing extreme poverty, or what's also called extreme humility. Okay? So, Dante goes on, line 73. But lest too covertly, Dante writing this goes on. This is St. Thomas Aquinas speaking. But lest too covertly I should proceed, that is, too hiddenly, know that in all this tale the lover's parts by Francis and poverty are played. In other words, I need to make the allegory clear. The person that I'm speaking about is Francis, and the lover is poverty. Okay? So he goes on. Line 79. That venerable Bernard first threw off his shoes and ran, and quick as he went too slow, running to so great peace, him seemed to move. This is not Bernard of Clairvaux, the founder of the Cistercian monks. This is Saint Bernard, the first follower of Saint Francis, before he's Saint Francis. Okay, a wealth and dreamed, of gods that teem and grow, etc., etc. So, line 91, we're told Francis makes known to Pope Innocent III his purpose, that is, he wants to found a monastic order dedicated to poverty, to emulate Christ, etc., etc. Innocent blesses it and enrolls his order, setting the first seal thereon. He gets a papal blessing, right? He goes off, top of the next page, 152, the stanza 100, he goes off, he preaches in Greece to the, not in Greece, in Egypt, excuse me, to the Sultan there. Sultan, kindly listens to him, or the head of Egypt kindly listens to him, is not converted, sends him back on his way. Line 106, then he received from Christ upon the bare ridge between Tiber and Arno that last seal which 2 years long his body lived to wear. It's talking about the stigmata. He received in his hands, according to tradition, the imprints of the nails, and his hands bled. Okay? And he had that for 2 years prior to his death. Okay? So skip down a little bit. Let's see here. We get down to line 124. Okay? Thomas is still speaking, and he says, 121. And such a steersman was our patriarch. He's talking about St. Dominic now. Okay? Hence thou wilt see that whoso follows him sails with rich cargo laden to the bark. But now his flock, Dominic's, the Dominicans, is now who he's referring to. Feel such a gluttonous whim for fancy foods, they range o'er wood and glen dispersed, and so it needs must be with them. So he praises Francis and the Franciscans, and now he castigates not St. Dominic, but the followers of St. Dominic. Okay? And he says, line 130, some, fearing to be lost, cling, true enough, still to their shepherd, but they're few indeed. there are some good, honest, true, you could say, Dominicans he is suggesting. Okay? But he says they are few and far between. To cut their cowls would take but little stuff. And now, if thou hast heard and paid good heed, and if my speech is not ambiguous, and if thou dost recall my former rede, that is my former advice, thy will's half won, for 'twill be obvious now to what kind of tree I have been laying the axe, and what rebuke I hinted thus. Where is good fattening if there be no straying? Okay? He means if you stray from the monastic rule, and part of that monastic rule is what? Poverty. Poverty, chastity, silence, essentially. Okay, but also poverty includes, you eat plain food. You're not an Epicurean. You don't eat the best. You don't dress in the finest clothing. Okay, it's, wool or rough hair kind of clothing, etc. Where is good fattening if there be no straying? Means you can't have fat monks if they're obeying their monastic rules. All right. So go on to Canto 12. And we're told, okay, now keep in mind, he's still in the heaven of the sun. There's been the circle of lights around him, okay, which we had referred to earlier. And if you turn to page 166, you've got this diagram. So the first circle of lights is the smaller circle, and then the larger circle is the one out here. He and Beatrice have been surrounded by this first circle of lights right here, okay, who's comprised of Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, Chrétien, etc., etc. And now the second circle of lights appears, right? And we're told, page 157 at the beginning, as the last word fell from that blessed fire, that is from St. Thomas, straightway the heavenly millstone set in train its former motion and melodious gyre. That is, it starts to spin again. And it doesn't spin a full revolution before the second circle appears around it, right? And both circles are singing, and we're told, line 19, so did the sempiternal roses, the circles, wreathe twofold about us, and antiphonal in song, the outer to the inner breathe. So it's like the outer song sings, the inner circle responds, etc. Then, when the dance and high festival made up, singing of joyful and leaping flame, light upon light, serene and joyous all, by one mind moved. See, these circles are moving, and they're kind of imaging the moving of the 9 spheres. And the 9 spheres all move. Why? Because God's mind moves them. By one mind moved, and at one moment came to rest, both circles stop spinning, as when the will that moves the eyes together shuts or opens both of them. So, line 28. From one new heart of fire was heard to rise a voice. That is, one of the flames in the outer circle starts to speak. Like the needle to the pole, turn me to whence it came. Needle to the pole, it's the image of a compass. Take a compass, kind of twist it up and down, turn around in circles, and it'll take a moment for the needle to point north. And he says, and I kind of looked around, and he found the needle. And this voice says, line 31, the love that makes me beautiful, that is God, bids me proclaim that captain who praised mine, okay, and him in turn extol. So now St. Bonaventure, that's the speaker, is going to relate the story of St. Dominic. Why? Because St. Dominic is the captain of the Dominicans, the leader of the Dominicans, St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. St. Bonaventure, who's a Franciscan, is now going to praise the Dominicans, just like St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a Dominican, praised the Franciscans. Okay? So he says, bids me proclaim that captain who praised mine with such fair words, and him in turn extol. One with the other we must still combine, and as they waged their warfare side by side, that is, the Dominicans and the Franciscans weren't against each other, they had the same lofty goal, the espousal of the church and such. Let side by side their mingled glory shine, following its banner with uncertain stride, Christ's army, once rearmed at such dear cost, was straggling on, thin, ranked, and terrified. He's suggesting, prior to St. Dominic founding the Dominicans, the church militant down here on earth was growing weak and straggly, so that the eternal emperor, not the Holy Roman Emperor, God the Emperor, was disposed not by their merit, but by his sole grace to reinforce his gravely threatened host. And so God showered grace upon the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and for his bride's relief, the bride, meaning the church, was pleased to raise two champions, fit by word and deed to rally those who were strays. Okay? So he goes on and he talks about where St. Dominic was born and such, and who his parents were. His father was named Joy, Felix. His mother was named Joanna, which means abounding in the grace of Jehovah and such. We're told about Dominic's name, line 67 and following. And there, that name and nature might accord, that is, that the name might kind of bear witness to his true nature, seeing whose he was, the whose is God's. The Spirit going forth named him by the possessive of the Lord. Domine is Latin for Lord. Dominic means of the Lord. So he was named possessive of the Lord, right? So we're told, line 76, his nurse found him many times laying on the ground, and that's laying ground, arms outstretched. Why? In an attitude of prayer. Keep in mind, the word attitude means position, right? It doesn't have to do with, mental disposition per se. She would find him in prayer, okay? He grew a mighty doctor soon, that is teacher. The word doctor comes from doctus, comes from docare, which literally means to teach, okay? Who scanned in every part that vine, that is the church, all too sure withers if dressed by an unskillful hand. That is, he scanned, he learned, he determined that the church would wither if it's not dressed, if it's not tended like a garden, okay, by a skillful hand. And from that sea, that is Rome, which once but now no more. Notice, Dante is castigating the church. I blame not it, that is, I don't blame the cathedral seat itself, St. Peter's Basilica and such, but him who there doth fix his cankered sway. Dante really doesn't like the current pope. Cherish the righteous poor. No leave to pay out 3 or 4 for 6, no tithes crape. That is, he's saying, Dominic didn't go to the Pope and say, hey, if I collect this much money, can I only give half of it away or a third of it away? No, he gave away what he received. Okay? But only licensed to fight ceaselessly. This is what he went to the Pope for, 994. Against the erring world for that good seed whence 24 scions girdly. And that's why you now see these 24 lights, because of Saints Dominic, okay, and St. Francis, with apostolic sanction guaranteed, equipped with doctrine and with zeal as well. The Dominicans were known for their doctrinal devotion, for their educational attainment. Franciscans were known for their practice of piety, okay, for their practice of poverty and helping others. The Dominicans more for their intellectual attainment and for espousing the purity, the doctrinal purity of the faith. He goes on, with apostolic sanction guaranteed, equipped with doctrine and with zeal as well, like some high torrent thundering down at speed, Copper 160, on briars and brakes of heresy he fell uprooting them. See, St. Dominic's goal, let's call it, was to uproot heresy, was to purify the belief system of the church. Okay? And still was swift to go where opposition was most formidable. In other words, he didn't shy away from a fight. When he found those who, he believed were teaching heresy or blasphemy, he went after them. Okay? So St. Bonaventure goes on. 115. His family, this is referring to the descendants, not the literal descendants, but the intellectual, that is, the Dominicans after St. Dominic. His family, once orderly aligned, following his steps, that is, they used to obey his order, they used to obey his monastic rule, have so turned head to tail that those in front collide with those behind. But soon shall come the harvest with its tale of rank bad farming, and the tares be cast out of the barn, and loud shall be their wail. What's he mean? Soon shall come the harvest. That is, they're going to get cleaned up. And those who aren't producing good fruit, it's the tale of the vine dresser that Christ gives the parable of the vineyard and such in John 17, I think it is. Okay? They're going to be uprooted. True, line 121. If one searched our volume first to last, leaf after leaf, he'd find one now and then inscribed, where once I stood, I still stand fast. That is, if you trace the history of the Dominicans from St. Dominic to today, you'd find every now and then a good Dominican monk who could say, where once I stood, I still, I haven't swayed. I haven't backed off what I believed and what I taught. Okay? But such will not be found among the men of Aquasparta or Casal who play now fast, now loose with rule and discipline. And you've got a gloss there about Aquasparta and Casal. Referring to Matthew of Aquasparta, a village in Umbria, who on being appointed general of the Franciscan order in 1287 introduced relaxations of discipline and such. Okay, so he's talking about his own. Yeah, he's talking about his own family here now. St. Bonaventure is. Okay, he's not talking about the Dominicans. Sorry, I misspoke. 115 through 120, he was talking about Dominicans. 121, he refers to our volume, that is, the Franciscans, because he said something bad about the later Dominicans, and now he's saying, but to be honest, Bonaventure's life makes bright my ray, that's who I am. Okay, and then he names the other stars. Austin with the Illuminato blends, Hugh of St. Victor, Peter Mangiador, Peter of Spain, blah, blah, blah. And he goes off and names all these saints, Nathan the Prophet, St. John Chrysostom, Anselm, etc., etc. Okay. So, go on to Canto, that was 12, I believe. Canto 13. So the double circle again starts to move around Dante and Beatrice. singing of the three persons and the one nature of God, etc., etc. We're told, line 16. Like a ring within a ring embrace, they shine, and both together make rotation, each in its pacing by the other paced. You'll get some shadow, that is, if you imagine this, you'll get some shadow of the constellation and double dance that really circled so about the spot wherein I kept my station. That is, Dante is unmoving. He and Beatrice occupying the same position they had. Okay, and he's describing this movement of the two circles. And he says, you'll get an image of what I'm talking about, but just a faint shadow, line 22. For these things overgo as much our usage, that is, our language, as the sphere that runs swiftest of all outspeeds the Chiana's flow. Okay? Bacchus nor Pan made their antiphons, that is, they're not praising Bacchus or Pan, but the one nature in the persons three, the Trinity. That's all they sing about. And in one person, that and ours at once. That, the divine nature, the Trinitarian nature, and ours, human nature. Line 28, page 170. Their measure done of dance and melody, the sacred fires again gave heed to us, turning from task to task with right good glee. Okay? And so St. Thomas addresses Dante again. The light who told me all that marvelous tale of the Lord's first mendicant, St. Francis, he says, then broke the hush of the harmonious hallows thus. And he says, with one sheaf threshed already and the seed stored, love's kindness makes me fain to bring the next one to the swingle stroke. That is, I've addressed one of your questions. Now I'm going to address the other. He says, into that breast, line 37, thou thinkst, whence was ta'en the rib from which the cheek was fashioned fair, whose palate brought about the whole world's bane. What is he talking about? Well, into that breast, whence was taken the rib. So he's talking about Adam, whose rib was taken from him for God to make Eve, which the cheek was fashioned fair, Eve's, whose palate brought about the whole world's bane. How did her palate? Because in the biblical story of Genesis, Satan told Eve, look at that fruit. Did God tell you that in the day that you shall eat of it, you shall surely die? You will not die, but you shall be like God, knowing good from evil. And she looked at it, we're told, and she desired it for the knowledge it would give her. Well, palate refers to taste. Taste refers to desire for something, whether that desire, if you're talking literally about taste, is for sweet or for bitter or for sour, okay? And into that which felt the thrusting spear, that's Christ's side. So notice what Dante has just done. You take the rib from Adam's side. Interestingly, did God have to make a wound? Did Adam have a scar after that? Okay. You put the rib in Eve's side. Was she not quite finished when God did that? And then you stick the spear in Christ's side. And so for past and future, paid the fine which on those scales outweighs all sin soe'er. That is, Christ, whose side was pierced with the spear, paid the fine. Such light as may in human nature shine was all infused by him, that is, by God, second person of the Trinity, that did create both one and other. Who's the one and other? Adam, Eve, all human nature, with his power divine. Hence thy surprise at what I said of late, namely, that this fifth light of ours doth hold an excellence that ne'er had duplicate. The fifth power in the circle is Solomon, okay? His point is You're wondering how Solomon is this fifth light of this circle. You know, what's the biblical story of Solomon? Son of King David. We're going to find out a little later on, you know. God essentially asks Solomon what is it he would wish, and Solomon asks for wisdom. Wisdom to be a good king. And God says, because you didn't ask for age, eternal life, because you didn't ask for money, I will grant you this wish. Okay? But if you read in the Old Testament about Solomon's life, what do we hear? Well, Solomon kind of left the path of wisdom. You know, he has 700 wives and 300 concubines, or 700 concubines and 300 wives, etc., etc. And he doesn't die necessarily in a good state. So Dante's kind of perplexed. Wait a second, because the whole church tradition, the medieval Catholic Church tradition, is, was Solomon really all that wise, so to speak? Okay, so we're told, line 52, all that which dies and all that dieth not is not, that is nothing, but splendor of the idea that knows the Father's love whereby it is begot. So everything that is immortal and everything that isn't, like angelic beings, they're immortal. They cannot be killed. They can't die. And plants, which are mortal, they do die. They're nothing but splendor of the idea. And you don't get a gloss for splendor here. So what does it mean? They're like the overflowing expression, okay, of the idea that knows the Father's love whereby it is forgot. That is, God is so overflowing in love that love pours out from the idea, which here, the Word, okay, that's the second person of the Trinity, becomes Jesus Christ, okay? It's so overflowing that it's like it spills out, and that's creation. And it spills out into immortal forms and mortal forms, okay? Because the living luminance, the light, that's Christ, that flows forth from its luminant, its lighter. Christ is the only begotten, but begotten of the Father for all eternity, yet parts not thence. That is, it's the light coming from the light giver, but it's not separated from the light, nor from the love, Holy Spirit, that entrines with those. Notice he creates a word. It intrinities with those. Okay? So the living luminance, and then you get the rest of the real sentence that follows, doth of its grace converge its radiance, its glory, classed as it were in 9 subsistences. These are the 9 spheres. Okay? Itself still one, eternal impermanence. That is, its glory bounds over into all these subsistences, okay? And yet it is not any less of its glory. That he doesn't lose any of its glory, any of his glory, right? The 9 subsistences, your gloss tells you the 9 orders of the angelic beings. Cherubim, seraphim, archangels, etc., etc. Okay? Which radiance, the outpouring glory of God, if you want, thence to the last potencies descends, from act to act becoming even such as to make mere brief contingencies, things that don't last long. Now, mere brief contingencies, I don't know exactly what that is referring to. Going on a walk with my wife and one of my kids the other day, and we were talking about animals and how long they live, and my son mentioned hamsters. Well, hamsters don't live very long, 2-3 years at most. Some dogs, live much longer than that. Other animals, elephants live longer than that. Galapagos turtles can live 100, 150, 200 years. Okay. If you go back to the Old Testament, Adam and the early patriarchs, Methuselah and such, they lived several hundred years and then died. So what's he getting at? Well, the farther away, so to speak, one gets from the person of God, according to Dante's logic, the less life one has. Okay? And I think there's going to be a problem, which I'm going to point out in a moment. Because notice what he's saying. It's the oversplendoring of God, the overglory of God that gives creation to creation and such. But he says, as you get farther and farther, thence to the last potencies descends, you get mere brief contingencies. That is, things that don't last. Okay? So just kind of hold that. An epithet, as I conceive it, given to things engendered, formed as requisite from seed or seedless by the moving heaven. Now, more or less of light such things transmit when stamped with the idea. So variable are both the wax and that which stampeth it. So, you take a light and you move it farther away and you receive less of the light. So variable, he says, is the wax. So take a ball of wax or take a sheet of wax and stamp it with something. So variable are both the wax and that which stampeth it. What's he mean, that which stampeth it? Okay? The thing that puts the impression. Well, if the thing that puts the impression is not directly God himself, but is something made by God and something made by that and something made by that, you get all the way down here, what's the idea? The final thing stamped is further removed from the real idea. Here's an example. Take a book like this and photocopy it. And then photocopy that photocopy. And keep doing that. What do you eventually have? You get something that is not clear and legible. Okay? That's the image Dante wants us to work with. So, wherefore the tree brings forth good fruit or ill after its kind, and mortals are born rich in various gifts of intellectual skill. Were the wax always wrought to perfect pitch, might at full power the spheres unchanging stand. The signet's light would shine complete in each. If the thing made were always made perfectly, it had the full power of the thing that made it, then it would perfectly reflect the thing that made it. But nature fumbles with no sure command over her tools, like an artificer who knows his trade but has a trembling hand. Okay? So he's comparing nature to a craftsman. I'm going to be sexist. To a craftsman. And he says, nature that doesn't have sure command, perfect command over her gifts, okay, every now and then screws up, slips up, right? Yet should love's self on what his fires prepare, stamp the clear image of the primal worth, total perfection would be compassed there. Compassed, that is formed, encompassed, okay? Such act it was that dignified dull earth to mold the noblest animal of all, such act it was begat the virgin birth. So, break this all down. he's talking about how there can be essentially imperfection down here when up there, directly with God, there's perfection. And notice, what happens with the virgin birth? He says, God directly, through the Holy Spirit, impregnates Mary. That's why Christ is perfect. Okay? What about everybody else? Well, he begat Adam. And notice, Adam lived a long time. Adam didn't have the longest life. That goes to Methuselah, one of his great-great-grandchildren, if I remember correctly. Okay? Methuselah lived 969 years. Adam lived 800, 900 years. I don't remember the exact number. Okay? And the farther down you go from Adam, the shorter the lifespan becomes. And the implication is the farther away from Adam you go, the more corrupt, so to speak. Is that accurate, though? According to Christian theology, I'm asking, is that accurate? Because he's kind of suggesting, everything was perfect at the beginning, but then it's because God didn't make it perfectly what this whole passage is leaving out is the effect of the fall of Adam and Eve, even though it's alluded to at the beginning with Eve. Okay? He's kind of suggesting the reason there is imperfection in the world is because God didn't directly create, for example, this bottle. Okay? If God had directly created this bottle, it would never corrupt. Or this shirt that I'm wearing. Okay? In 20 years, this shirt will be threadbare and worn, and probably won't even be around in 20 years. Now, that might be the theology of the medieval Catholic Church, but that's not the theology of the entire Christian church, because more generally, the Christian church suggests everything at the beginning was perfect. And we know that because in each day of creation, God finishes the day of creation with, and it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day, or fourth day, or fifth day, etc. Everything was perfect, all right? Plus, as I suggested the other day, Dante's playing on here the Augustinian notion that Adam and Eve were perfect at their creation, okay? Almost like God. And then they fell and they, fell a huge distance, okay? In the Eastern Church, that's not the belief system. The idea is that, they weren't supremely nearly perfect. They had to attain perfection, all right? So he goes on, because it's almost like he's forgotten that he was talking about Solomon. Line 94. A king he was, so runs my argument, and wisdom did he crave for his behoof, that as a king he might be competent. Okay? So he says, line 104, then kingly prudence is that insight true my shaft was aimed at, and unmatched is just. What's he talking about? Let's look at the note, 103. Solomon, actually she doesn't gloss those lines. Why do I have them underlined? And if that phrase, line 106, and if that phrase, none rose, thou rightly view, thou see that kings alone are meant by this, wherever, okay, I see. Let me back up. Go back to 94. A king he was, so runs my argument, and wisdom did he crave for his behoof, that as a king he might be competent. Not how to count these movers high aloof, that is, the angelic orders, or the 9 concentric spheres, or know if error contingent and necesse could yield necesse in the final proof. That is, Solomon didn't ask for the understanding of how the world worked. He didn't ask for knowledge about the deep workings of the mind of God. Not line 100, not CS dare primum motum esse. He didn't ask for line 100. Chiglaw says, he didn't ask God to reveal to him how many are the intelligences that move the heavenly spheres, whether in logic a limitation occurring in either of the premises can be escaped to the conclusion, whether it must be conceded there is such a thing as first motion, whether the truths of geometry are valid throughout the universe, etc., or if triangles and half circles must be right-angled states facts with accuracy. He says he didn't ask for any of that. Kingly prudence is that insight true my shaft was aimed at. That is, that's what he asked for. And unmatched is just. How unmatched? Because he's going to compare Solomon's kingly wisdom with all the kings since then. And if that phrase, none rose, thou rightly view, thou'lt see that kings alone are meant by this, whereof are many. None rose to his level, but the good ones, few. And that's Dante kind of saying, I'm looking at you, king of Hungary, you, king of Germany, you, king of France, you, king of... With this distinction, take, but don't take amiss, my words consistent thus with thy true thought concerning the first father, Adam, and our bliss, perfection and paradise. And to thy feet, and to thy feet be this a hobble wrought of lead, to make thee move at sluggard pace toward yea and nay where thou perceivest not. In other words, he's saying, slow down. Notice, he wants to hobble Dante's feet, to make thee move at sluggard pace. What pace towards what? Toward yea and nay, where thou perceivest not, where you don't know the answer. Don't do what? Jump to a conclusion. Don't issue a quick judgment. For lo among the dunces is his place who hastens to accept or to reject, with no distinction made twixt case and case. Distinction, without determining how these cases are different. Thence come rash judgments, mostly incorrect and prejudiced. Just look at Oedipus, just look at Agamemnon. I mean, look at a lot of the decisions we saw made in those plays, okay? And stubborn all the more that self-conceit shackles the intellect. Self-conceit, self-assurance, assuming that one knows all the answers. It does what? It fetters, it handcuffs the intellect. It binds the intellect from actually working through, okay? And he goes on and mentions a couple of heretics and such. Sabellius and Arius, founders of two heresies, the Sabellian heresy and the Arian heresy. The Arian heresy was one pretty early in the church, the 300s, that essentially said Jesus wasn't God. In fact, Arius said there was a time when the second person of the Trinity was not, or there was a time when the Son was not. The church said, no, the Son always was. The Son was eternally begotten of the Father. If you have the Father, you automatically have the Son, etc. Okay? Council of Nicaea in AD 325 which came up with the first kind of part of the Nicene Creed, talking about the Son, was entirely to condemn Arius. No one, he says, should ever be too self-assured in judgment, like a farmer reckoning his gains before the corn crop is matured. Don't assume you're always right, he suggested. Okay? Line 139. Let Jack and Jill not think they see so far. Jack and Jill, just, Joe and Susan, average people. Let Jack and Jill not think they see so far that, seeing this man pious, that a thief, they see them such as in God's sight they are. Don't assume that because you think this person over here is pious and this person over here is a thief, that that's how God sees them. For one may rise, the other come to grief. And that's an allusion to the crucifixion. Okay? And I can't believe she does not have a gloss on that. If you remember the story of the crucifixion, I believe it's in St. Luke's Gospel. What are we told? Two thieves are crucified on either side of Christ. One on the right side, one on the left side. Okay? The one on the left side rails against Christ and says, if you're really the Christ, save us and yourself, etc., etc. What does the one on the right hand say? He said, how dare you? This man has done nothing. Talking about Christ. This man has done nothing. He is blameless. And then he says to Christ, remember me, O Lord, when you come into your kingdom. And Christ turns to him and says, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. Okay. Are we told that the one on the right is not a thief? No, we're not. We're told he is a thief. But because he confesses Christ by saying, remember me, O Lord, when thou comest into thy kingdom, Christ blesses him for that faith and says, today you will be with me in paradise. Notice that means a couple of things. One, when they die, Christ will be in paradise. And two, the thief will be with him. Okay? Notice, one may rise, the other come to grief. I don't know if you've ever seen what's sometimes called an Orthodox cross, like this one. Okay? If you look closely at it, notice, trying to get it set straight, one side of this lower bar is raised up and the other one points down. Why? Well, this is the side that's pointing up. This is the side that's pointing down. What side is this on? It's on the right side of the cross. The left side of the cross is pointing down. Why? The good thief, the one who confessed Christ, was on his right side. The other was on his left side. The bar points upwards on the right, symbolizing that the good thief on the right rose. He ascended into heaven when he died. The bad thief descended. He went into hell when he died. Did you notice in purgatory the movement? When Dante starts, when he meets Virgil and they begin by going into hell from limbo, what direction do they go? They always turn to the left. He goes downwards, spiraling leftwards. Left in Latin is sinister. Sinister. Right? They go all the way down. They keep going to the left. When they get to purgatory, what do? they turn to the right. As they make their way up Mount Purgatory, they always go to the right. Okay? Canto 14. So now they're in they're still in the circle of the sun, the sphere of the sun, but they ascend to the sphere of Mars. Okay? A third circle of light appears. But it begins with Canto 14. Beatrice asks the souls some questions concerning, their radiance at the Last Judgment and such. Okay? And she asks the question because the question is in Dante's mind, but he kind of doesn't want to. So she asks, notice she says, line 10, this man is need, though unexpressed, being muted of voice, yet not in thought articulate, nor yet in thought articulate, to trace another truth to where it's rooted. He wants to find the basis of this, okay? And so she says, so tell him if this radiance floriate, like florid, like covered in flowers and stuff, blooming, thus in your substance shall as now remain unchanged with you, eternal as your state. And if it shall, go further and explain, how shall your mutual brightness not annoy your sight when you're restored to sight again? That is, when you have your bodies back with you, how will your glory, the radiance you have now, not bother your physical eyes? Okay? And we're told they kind of break into music and such. And then line 23, top of page 179. Solomon replies. That's why we had Solomon introduced. Okay, because he's the wisest person. He that laments because we die below to live up yonder sees not how they spring, those showers eternal, freshening where they flow. That is, he that laments, cries out, because we die down here, only to live up here, implying the flesh stays below and only the soul rises. He doesn't understand how those showers eternal freshen where they flow. That is, they come from God. So the souls and the bodies are fresh, they're renewed. The 1 and 2 and 3 that there is king, the one Godhead, two natures of Christ, human and divine, and 3, the Trinity, and lives forever, 3, 2, and 1, lives together as Trinity, now with the 2 natures, human and divine, in the one. Okay? By not containing everything. That is, he, God, is uncontained. The psalmist uses the language, he is uncircumscribed. That is, you can't draw a circle around him, and yet contains everything. Keep in mind the image, that Dante is playing on, this Ptolemaic image. Earth down at the bottom, 9 concentric spheres, and above that is the Empyrean, which is where God is. And so, God's out here, kind of all-encompassing, and within, you then have the 9 spheres, okay? Line 31. Was 3 times hymned in such melodious tone by every spirit there, as well might carry praise of worth past all comparison. And then, from the divinest luminary, that is Solomon, I heard a voice, mild as the angels was belike to Mary. Okay? Long as shall last the feast of paradise, even so long our love shall lace this radiance round us for our festal guise. Well, what's the feast of paradise? It's the wedding feast of the Lamb. It's eternity. You know, when you get to the end of the book of Revelation, and it talks about the wedding feast of the Lamb, when you go into the heavenly Jerusalem and all that, that lasts forever. So he says, even so, our love shall lace this radiance. We will keep this radiance. Its brightness with our fervor, our love of God, shall keep pace, fervor with sight, sight so enlarged the mesh of its own worth as it hath more of grace. And it will get brighter and brighter and brighter as it has more grace. And when we put completeness on afresh, that is, when we are made whole again, because right now they're disembodied souls, they're incomplete. When we are made complete with our bodies, all the more gracious shall our person be. Gracious means full of grace, reclothed in the holy and glorious flesh. Why will the flesh be holy and glorious? Well, it's holy, first of all, because go back to the beginning of Genesis, when God first made Adam, he made everything, and everything that has materiality, he said, that is good. So therefore it's good, okay? How good is it? God enters into it. God takes on materiality. In becoming human flesh, God transforms all human flesh, according to Christian theology, okay? That's why it becomes glorious and holy, sacramental. That is, every person, no matter how sinful they are, is a bearer of the divine image. And as such, a bearer of grace. It might be dirtied, it might be polluted, but it's still there, right? So, whereby, that is from that holy and glorious flesh, whereby shall grow the unearned gift and free the highest good bestows. What's the unearned gift and free? Grace. That gift of light by which we are enabled him to see. We will be given grace. That's, St. Paul says, by grace you will become partakers of the divine nature, okay? Or Peter. Paul says, by grace you are become sons of God, heirs of God, co-heirs with Christ. Christ is an heir of God because he is the only begotten, eternally begotten Son of God. Those who follow Christ become it by grace, okay? So he says, because of that, you will receive this gift of light that will enable us to see him. You go back to the Old Testament, book of Exodus. God tells Moses, no living person can see me and live. Because Moses asks, let me see you, when he's on Sinai. God says, you hide yourself in that rock there, and I'll walk past you, and I'll cover you with my hand, and you can turn and look at my backside. You can't see my face and live. There, in heaven, resurrected bodies, St. Paul says in Corinthians, we shall see him face to face. Okay? So, hence, must we ever win to more of sight. That is, from that point on, from when the body is reunited with the soul, we must ever win. It doesn't mean we have to strive. It means we will ever see more and more, better and better, clearer and clearer. And by more sight, more fervor, love, still acquire. The deeper we see, he's suggesting, into God's face, the more we will love God. And the more we love God, the deeper we will see. And the deeper we will see, the more we will love. Ad infinitum, to infinity. All right? But as the living coal which shoots forth fire outgoes it incandescence, and is found whole at the heart of it with shape entire. Notice he's talking about a burning coal. The fire comes off of it, but the coal is still there, and the coal is still brighter than the fire that comes off. The luster which already swathes us round shall be outlustered by the flesh. We're like the fire that comes out, he says, when we're reunited with our bodies. The glory we have then. You think we're radiant now, Dante. Whew. When we are reunited with our bodies, it will be more glorious than you can imagine. Why? Because it's like he's only seen half of what they ought to be, which long day after day now molders underground. That is, our bodies now, they're dust, right? Nor shall that light have power to do us wrong, the light of our bodies reunited with our souls, since for all joys that shall delight us then, the body's organs will be rendered strong. That is, when the body is reunited with the soul, the body's powers, sensory powers, will be more than anything we can imagine now. The sense of hearing will be mind-blowingly better. The sense of sight, for those of us who wear glasses, we can't imagine, okay? But he's saying we'll be able to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch what we can only dream of now, right? So, as the third circle starts to appear, Dante and Beatrice rise to the third circle. The next circle, Mars. The third circle I was talking about was the circle of beings, okay? And Dante says, line 88, with my whole heart and in that tongue which all men share, I made burnt offering to the Lord, such as to this new grace was suitable. And ere the sacrificial fire had soared forth of my breast, I knew my prayer had sped, accepted, and found favorable accord for such bright splendors. And so ruby red within two rays appeared. O Eloi, I cried, O Lord, that givest them thus the accolade, as white between the two poles of the sky, gleaming and decked with great and lusty stars, riddle of sages shines the galaxy. E'en so constellate in the depth of Mars, that is, the sphere of Mars, those rays displayed, the venerable sign traced in a circle by the quadrant bars. So take a circle and divide it into four. And what do you have? You've got a cross. So the lights, the splendors of the circle of Mars, the sphere of Mars, shape themselves into a cross. And we're told, line 103, here memory beats me, and my wits resign their office. Again, here. Here means two things. At this place in the story, but I think he also means here, back in my study, recollecting this so I can write it down. Memory beats me, and my wits resign their office. For that cross so flashed forth Christ as beggars all similitude of mine. Similitude, example, image, sign, symbol. He's saying, I'm at a loss for words. I can't describe this. He has a beatific vision. He has a vision of Christ. But whoso takes his cross and follows Christ will, pardon me this gap in my narration, when, lightning through heaven's brightening, he sees Christ. Okay? If you take up your cross and follow Christ, that is, if you deny yourself, if you die for Christ, when you ascend through heaven and you see Christ, you will do what? You will say, okay, Dante, now I understand. I see why you couldn't write it. Okay? Line 121. So from the lights which there appeared to me swelled in the cross a song, obscure to sense, which yet entranced me with its melody. That is, I couldn't understand the words, but the melody was beautiful. I listen when I go to bed at night. I put on my iPad, I play music. I play Russian Orthodox chant. I don't know Russian. If the chant were in English, I would know it because I know all the hymns that they're singing. But I don't know Russian. It's the melody and the voices that are enthralling and relaxing. Okay? That's kind of what Dante's saying here. For some high song of praise, I knew it since, and he picks out two words, arise, conquer, although I heard it not with full intelligence. And there's a gloss there, I believe. No, that's not what. Your gloss says the hymn of praise is addressed to Christ, conqueror of death and hell. That's true. Hold on a second. Let me find this. I'm not positive, but I think this might be an allusion to Psalm 68. Let God arise, let his enemies be scattered. Let them also that hate him flee before him. As smoke is driven away, so drive them away. As wax melteth before the fire, so let the wicked perish at the presence of God, but let the righteous be glad. Let them rejoice before God. Yea, let them exceedingly rejoice, etc., etc. And it's, it goes on about God leading his people and defending the defenseless and being a father for the fatherless, etc. Okay? This so enamored me, Dante says, line 127, that well I know nothing I'd seen till then had bound my breast, that is, taken control of me, with such sweet fetters, like he's now enchained, or enthralled me so. Maybe this seems too daringly expressed as placing second those blessed eyes and fair gazing, whereon my longings find their rest, talking about Beatrice. Yet since more power in each more loftier sphere, the living sigils, signs, that's what sigils means, of all beauty wield, and to those eyes I'd not yet turned me there, that is, to Beatrice's eyes, think, and to my self-accusation yield the excuse which was its pretext, yea, and count me truthful, holy joys being not expelled, those heights but growing pure as they mount. The vision, the experience of joy grows pure and more powerful, the higher and higher he goes. Okay. Okay, Canto 15. Let's see here. Trying to see where to pick up. I've got several things highlighted. Let's start on page 187, around line 37. So one of the souls goes to the foot of the cross and, addresses Dante. And we find out it's Dante's ancestor, Cacciaguda. Sorry, my pronunciation is really bad, I'm sure. So we're told, then appearance joyful as in sound, The Spirit added things to this beginning I could not grasp. His speech was too profound. Not that on purpose he concealed his meaning. Necessity was cause of this effect. His thought so far outsoared all human kinning. Kinning there meaning understanding. When the bow of burning love had checked its force a little, and his speech descended to hit the target of our intellect, meaning Dante's, these were the first words that I comprehended. Blessed be thou, O three in one, God, for this great courtesy unto my seed extended. So Dante's got to hear that unto my seed and think, well, okay, this person is an ancestor of mine, okay? A long, sweet eagerness, line 49, aroused by reading that great book, whose white and black abide eternal in changelessness, okay? The great book is God's foreknowledge, God's divine providence, right? So how does Ketchigoota read that? Thou hast assuaged my son within this light where I may now address thee, thanks to her who gave thee wings to soar to such a height. Her, Beatrice, or her, Mary, probably Beatrice, okay? So he says, thy thought flows into mine. Thou deemest clear from the first thought. As, once we grasped it, flow the 5 and 6 from the first integer. His point is, I know exactly what you're thinking because I see it, so to speak, as it comes from God's mind, okay? Line 61, rightly thou deemest thus, since great or small, we in this life gaze ever on that glass where thought, ere it be thought, is mirrored all. That is, you guess right, that we in this life, that is up here in the heavens, we gaze ever on that glass. Glass means like mirror, okay? Where thought is mirrored all. That's an interesting idea because he's essentially saying whatever God thinks we can understand or we can see. But we're going to find out not entirely, okay? So he keeps going on. Says line 67, let thine own voice assured and bold and gay ring out, give with the tongue, give will its word, ask away. Then will I speak what I'm ordained to say. See, by using the word ordained, that kind of puts an idea in Dante's mind. Well, how were you ordained? Why were you chosen to do this? Okay? So, skipping several passages, line 85. Nevertheless, to thee, bright topaz, living part of this rich jewel, I may yet make suit to gladden me by telling who thou art. Okay? Scion of mine, for whom 'twas bliss acute even to wait, and on thy coming count, thus his reply began, I was thy root. So Dante says, who are you? And he says, I am thy root. Thy surname hath its fount in one that now, some 100 years maybe, has circled the first cornice of the mount. He was my son, great-grandfather to thee, and meet it were thou pray for him to haste this weary toil of his and set him free. Ketchigoota has just told him, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, is now in the second circle, second cornice of purgatory, okay? He's purged off the P of pride, right? So they go on, they talk about Dante's mother's family from whom he gets the name Alighieri, etc. So skip a bit, go down to 130. To this good way of life for decent men, this dear, this tranquil homestead undefiled, friended with many a loyal citizen. He's talking about when he was alive. When the loud crying called her, Mary mild gave me. Your baptistry of ancient fame, and he finally names himself, made me both Catch-a-Gouda and God's child. That's line 135. Here for the first time, Dante's ancestor, okay, not very helpful. So he goes on, talks about riding in Emperor Conrad's side, line 142. And in his train, I marched to foreign fights against those infidels that through the sin of the chief pastors have usurped your rights. There was I reft by the vile Saracen. He was killed by a Muslim from this deceitful world whose vanities win many souls and ruin all they win, and came from martyrdom unto this peace. He was martyred. He was fighting on a crusade, okay, and died for the faith. That's why he is where he is. So go on to Canto 16. Notice how Dante begins. O puny glories of our blood and state. Puny glories, O little insignificant fame. If ye can swell men's hearts with pride down here, he's talking about down here on earth, okay, where passions pulse beats but a languid rate. In other words, the passions, the things we get really worked up about down here, it's nothing. The glory that we have in our family name, maybe you've got a name that goes back hundreds of years, or maybe you got a name, like a Kennedy or Bush or something like that. It's really famous, etc. Or you can trace your national lineage back, hundreds of years. He says that's nothing. Never shall I marvel more. For in that sphere where appetites unwarped, I gloried. Yea, even in heaven, I gloried in such gear, that is, in my family name. Yet that's a mantle which soon shrinks away. A mantle, something you wear, right? But it shrinks. It dissolves, you could say. Why? For round the edge time with his shears will go. It will wear it away. It will eat it away. The glory of family, the glory of name, unless we add to it from day to day. And what Dante's playing at here is this idea that he's addressed before, going all the way back to the Inferno, that one can take glory in one's family's noble name or the fame of one's nobility. And by talking about adding to it from day to day, he's talking about adding to one's nobility. How? By virtuous living, by behaving virtuously. And that kind of takes us back to the Garden of Eden. If Adam and Eve had lived virtuously, if they had said no to Satan and yes to God, they would have become, in their flesh, more and more like God and would still be alive. Okay? So with the you, which Rome first sanctioned, though today her children make less use thereof than others, I began my speech. He's talking about the formal you, which is used to address people in power, people of prestige. It's it's plural, like the royal we. Well, this is the royal you that Dante uses to address Catch-a-Gouda. Notice Beatrice smiles because Dante's being all formal here. So Dante addresses him, and Catch-a-Gouda says, in response to Dante, when did you live? Line 37 and following, he says, 550 and 30 times hath this our fiery star come to renew his flame. That is, Mars has circled the sun 580 times. Well, they thought Mars circled the sun in, I think it is 687 days. So you multiply 580 by 687, whatever it is, and you come up with the year something like 1010 or this line 37, 1106 for Ketchuguta's birth, okay? So he talks about, his life and such, and we're going to leave the rest of that canto. Pick up with Canto 17. So, because Ketchuguta makes it clear, he can see into the mind of God, so to speak, Dante's got questions. And Beatrice, line 7, says, "Speak on, nor damp thy ardent wish, but bring it out a door, perfectly minted with the inward stamp." In other words, perfectly express what you're questioning. Not that thy words can make our knowledge more, yet learn to tell thy longing, that the cruse may pour thee out the drink thou thirstest for. So, we're told, line 13, "Dear native soil, whom such high grace endues, fills with, that as men see no triangle can hold amid its angles more than one obtuse, an angle more than 90 degrees, so you, before they come to be, behold contingent things." You can see contingent things that happen in time before they happen. On that point, gazing still, God, that in one now doth all our times enfold. And we're at the end of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, where Boethius talks about the eternal present. God, being outside of time, sees all of time how? Now. So, because you see the mind of God as if it were a mirror, okay? He says, I heard lots of ominous things when I was both in Inferno and in Purgatory. Can you explain some of that? Right? Line 31. "In no dark oracle, like those that filled men's foolish minds with error once, ere yet the Lamb who taketh away sins was killed." That is, this isn't going to be some like a Tiresian oracle. I'm not going to speak to you in shadows and images. Right? These things that filled men's foolish minds, notice, before Christ, the Lamb who taketh away the sins of the world. It's John 1:29. Right? John sees Christ coming to be baptized, and he says to his disciples, "Behold the Lamb of God, who cometh to take away the sins of the world." All right? So, line 34. "But forthright speech, plain as the alphabet, replied, the love paternal, in that light hid and displayed, which heavenly smiles beget." And so he explains, "Contingents, which doth exercise no right beyond that frame of matter where you lie," that's on earth. It's only on earth that things are mutable, changeable, impermanent. That's what contingents means. Stands all depicted in the eternal sight. Everything that will happen on earth, Ketchuguta is saying, stands depicted in the mind of God. Right? "Though suffering thence no more necessity than doth the vessel down the river gliding from its reflection in the watcher's eye." So he uses a metaphor. Because I can see this in God's mind doesn't mean God is going to make it happen. Just as if I were to look, he says, in someone's eye and see the reflection of a boat moving down a river, The fact that the person sees the boat moving down the river doesn't make the boat move down the river. The fact that I can see what's going to happen to you in God's mind doesn't mean God is going to make it happen. Why so, or why not? Again, Boethius, because God's up here, right? Down here is time. God sees all of time. So if you were to turn and from down here, look up into God's eyes, what would you see? You would see all of time, beginning to end. Really rather brilliant when you think about it. Thence, or therefore, as sweet music to the ear comes sliding through the piped organ, comes into my mind the vision of thy life and times betiding, not yet happening. Right? And so what does he do? He goes on and explains to Dante exactly what's going to happen. Now, bear in mind, the journey occurs when? It starts Holy Thursday, okay, before Easter, Thursday before Easter. Actually starts very late, Great and Holy Wednesday evening. And now we're in, I want to say it's Wednesday or Thursday of Holy Week, after Easter, okay, in the year 1300, when Dante was 35. When's he actually writing it? Well, she says in the introduction, if I remember right, it's something like 1317. Dante began writing, according to one argument, began writing the Inferno around the year 1306, 1307. Another one says most of the Commedia was written between 1313, 1321. And we know the date when some of it has to have been written because he has people being killed or people who die prophetically, in like 1313. Well, if Dante's writing this in 1300, he could have known that, right? So, Cacciaguda goes on and explains the things that are going to happen to Dante. He's going to be exiled. Well, Dante was exiled after 1300. Okay. Talks about the whites and the blacks, the Ghibellines and such, the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, which we're going to talk about. Or we're not going to talk about. And then he says, line 133, thy cry shall beat as beats the wind most rough against the loftiest tops. No, I got to back up, sorry. So Cacciaguda finishes, line 100. Soon as his silence led me to believe that the blessed soul had shuttled all the woof across the warp and set for him to weave, Dante said, as one perplexed which way to move, Father, too well I see how time does spur hard on me with such blows as on the breast that shrinks, etc., etc. So, he wants to know, line 112, down in the world, when I go back down there, whose bitter knows no bourne, that is, whose bitterness knows no borders. It can just get worse and worse and worse. We like to think it can't get any worse than it is, and then it does. 2020, what's 2021 going to be like? Okay. All the way up for the hill, from whose bright tip I've mounted, by my lady's eye beams drawn, and after, while from light to light we slip through heaven, I've learned things such that if retold, they'd leave an acrid taste on many a lip. In other words, back down there, if I were to retell what I have seen, there would be a lot of angry people. Yet, if I am truth's friend and am not bold, my name, I fear, will live but a brief measure with those who call these days the days of old. If I'm truth's friend and am not bold, courageous, he says, then my name will not live very long. So should I be bold? Should I write it? And Ketchaguda says, 134, indeed, the conscience that is black with shame for deeds itself or others hatch will feel thy words a sore upon its back. It's like a lash, a whip. Nevertheless, give lies the quick dispatch. Make thy whole vision freely manifested. Tell it all. And where men feel the itch, there let them scratch. Again, it's a fantastic image. Lay it all out there, Dante. And if it makes somebody itch, what does that mean? Got them. You know, satire only works if the person being satirized realizes the folly, the foolishness that he or she is doing. See, the purpose of satire is to reform behavior. It's to get to someone, it's to, as Shakespeare put it, to hold the mirror up to nature. Okay, see, you know, look at how it reflects things. It's to hold the mirror up to nature so that the person sees him or herself and goes, oh my God, I'm being an ass. And stops being an ass. That's what he's talking about. You know, if you get the scratch, you get the itch and have to scratch it. Sour as thy speech may seem at first, when tasted, when it first goes in the mouth, 'twill leave behind it much good, wholesome stuff, very nutritious, once it's been digested. Notice what Dante is saying about books. What books can do. They can change lives. Yeah, some of this is hard to get through. But what's Ketchaguda saying there? But once it gets through the mouth and it goes down into you and sits there and it is digested, it's percolating in the mind. He says it will be good, wholesome stuff that is good for you. That thy cry, line 133, shall beat as beats the wind most rough against the loftiest tops. The loftiest tops, the tallest trees. What's the metaphor? The proud, the powerful, those with prestige. Yeah, it's gonna ruffle some feathers. This shall redound much to thine honor, and is cause enough why in these wheels and on the mount, and round about the dolorous vale that is in these wheels, circles of heaven, on the mount, purgatory, and in hell, thou hast been shown only those souls whose fame has made some sound. Right? For the most part, who does Dante meet? Famous people, powerful people. He doesn't, down in hell, he doesn't talk about, poor Joe, the next door neighbor who just, was a sorry piece of work. He picks the powerful ones to pick on, right? Because the hearer's mind is never prone to dwell on or put faith in illustrations derived from the obscure or the unknown or other unimpressive demonstrations. Last year, 2 years ago, I'm not going to get into politics, I'm just using this as an example. A member of the Trump administration wrote a book, can't remember the title, but it was, by anonymous, wrote an article, and it was by anonymous, published in the New York Times. And the New York Times said, this article is by leading, powerful, important member of the Trump administration, and he's pulling the curtain back and showing all this horrible stuff Trump is doing, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Everybody wondered at the time, who wrote this? Is it the Secretary of State? Is it the Secretary of Defense? Is it one of Trump's personal advisors? Is it, Jared Kushner? Who is it? Nobody knew. National Security Advisor, etc. Well, just a couple weeks before the election, the person who wrote it outed himself. Okay? And who was it? He was the former chief of staff of the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Okay, that is not a major player in the administration. That is not somebody with the ear of the president. Okay? It's a minor character. That's exactly what Cacciaguda is saying there. It had to be published by anonymous because if the person had put his name to his book, people would have said, "Ooh, why do we care what this guy says?" But if Mike Pompeo wrote that kind of book, or Mike Pence, vice president, that would be a very different case. Okay, Canto 18. Trying to see how much time. There we go. Hour and 40 minutes. Try and get us up to Canto 22. So, Beatrice says, the lady, Dante writes, line 4. The lady who is leading me to God, this is page 214, said, "Change thy thoughts. Bethink thee, I am near to him who lightens every sinful load." Okay? Because Dante, opening stanza, says that, he was thinking what Cacciaguda said, chewing the sweetness mingled with the sour. That is, he's trying to figure out what all of this means, what kind of life he's going to have when he goes back down. And she says, "Change thy thoughts." Why? Because I am near to God, who lightens every sinful load. What does she mean? I will entreat for you. I will pray for you. Okay? Who lightens every sinful load. He won't give you more than you can bear. Okay? And Dante turns to her because of the sound of her voice. And we're told in, what love I then descried in her blessed eyes, I dare not speak of here. Not only language plays me false, beside there's memory, which is powerless to retrace its course so far, save one should be my guide. Now that's Dante talking down here in his study, writing the Divine Comedy. I'm not only at a loss for words, I don't remember things as well as I ought to. He says, unless one, capitalized, so it means God, be my guide. This much I may report upon the case. My heart from every other longing went completely free while I perused her face. He looks at her, and every problem, every issue in his mind, we're told, is wiped away. Every fear, every doubt. Why? For the eternal joy, its radiance bent direct on Beatrice, and from her eyes reflected, held me in entire content. Okay? She told him, remember, I am near to God. He hears her voice. He looks at her. She's looking at him. He looks in her eyes. And what does he see? He sees the image of God reflected in her eyes. And that eternal joy, it's that contents him. St. Paul writes, be content in all things. Well, Dante is here. But notice, she slightly, just ever so slightly, reproves him. She, with a smile that left my faculties quite vanquished, said to me, that is, she just overwhelms him with her smile. She says, turn and give heed. Not in my eyes alone is paradise. Okay, so here's Dante. Okay, I'm not putting my hands straight in front of each other. Here's Dante, here's Beatrice. Okay, Dante, Beatrice. Dante turns and looks at Beatrice. She turns and looks at him. He sees in her eyes what? The reflection of God over here, right? So she's here, Dante's here, Dante's here, she's here. He sees God's reflection in her eyes, so God's out here. And what does she say? Turn and take heed. For paradise is not only found in my eyes. What does that mean? Turn around, Dante. Don't look at me. Look at what? Look at the source, is what she's saying. Look at the real source of joy. Don't look at reflected joy. Okay? As in men's faces here, we sometimes read their feelings plain, when they're so deep annoyed that all their minds to one sole thought are keyed. So in the sacred fire to which I turned, his wish to tell me more I plainly read, in the whole look of him, so bright he burned. This is talking about Kachaguda, okay? And he says, in this, the fifth whorl of the tree, that is the circle of Mars, that's nourished from its summit and bears fruit all seasons and whose leaves are never shed, are blessed souls of whom the mighty brute sent forth on earth, where ere to heaven they came as rich in themes for every poet's lute. Okay? These are people who died for the faith. It's interesting, I think at least, the language that I'm assuming the Italian has used and that Sayers has accurately translated into English. He calls this sphere the fifth whorl of the tree. What tree? The tree of existence. What other belief system, what other mythology talked about the worlds being connected to a tree? Germanic mythology. If you saw Thor, you've heard about it, okay? Yggdrasil. It has the 9 realms, the 9 planets, okay? Or the 9 spheres, if you want, the 9 worlds. So, Dante turns and he looks. And what does he see? He sees these flames. And we're told who they are. Joshua, Judas Maccabeus, Roland, Charlemagne, etc., etc. Okay. He turns to look at Beatrice, line 52, to, what do I do next? And he sees her eyes so clear, line 55, so lit all through with rapture that her loveliness outshined all earlier want, yea, and her latest too. And as a man feeling more peace of mind and doing well perceives he gains some ground daily, and is to virtue more inclined, so I perceiving, as we circled round, born with the spheres, this miracle increase, and they rise up to the sphere of Jupiter. Line 64, in such an instant change as when released from some embarrassment transforms, a fair complexioned lady and her blushes cease. Why this image of blushing? Not because she's guilty or sinful or embarrassed or anything like that. Where have they been? They've been in the circle of Mars. Go outside and look at Mars tonight. In the south east kind of sky. It's really red. Her complexion is reddened from having been in Mars. Now they're going up to Jupiter, right? Pure white, etc. And we're told Dante gets up there and he asks, O goddess Pegasean, line 82, that dost lay genius with glory, make it live long years, as it makes lands and cities by thine aid. Be thou my light to show these characters, because these stars, these lights, start to form letters in the sky. D-I-L. And he says, help me remember and portray this. In consonants and vowels 5 times 7, that is 35 letters, those signs displayed themselves. I noted down each several letter with the meaning given. Diligite justitiatum, verb and noun. These words came first and following afterwards. Qui judicatus terram. Love justice. You that judge the earth, is what that says. And then the final M changed form and shapes itself into first a lily and then an eagle. Okay? And you got that description, lines 103 and following. There's an eagle's neck and a crest. There's an eye. There's an eyebrow over the eye. It's in profile form. And he keeps looking at it. And we're told, line 124, O soldiers of that host celestial, on whom I gaze, pray for whole world run astray after ill example. So he's praying to them to pray for the world. Pray for all. Notice he doesn't say, pray for all good Catholic Christians. He doesn't say pray for the Catholic Church. He doesn't say pray for Christians. He says pray for all. Wars that the sword once waged are waged and won by banning now. Wherever men think fit, that bread the Father's love locks up from none. Banning, the banning now, that's talking about excommunication and interdiction, refusing certain places to be able to celebrate the Eucharist. The bread, the Eucharist. It's talking about that being banned. And thou, who writest but to annul the writ, the Pope, take heed. For Peter and Paul, who died to save the vineyard, the church, thou placed havoc with, live yet. That is, you down there, you think Peter and Paul are dead or just up in the egos. They're watching. But thou wilt answer, it's talking about the Pope, I who only crave for him who chose to dwell alone and then was danced away into a martyr's grave, know not of all your Pauls and fishermen. For him who chose to dwell alone, St. John the Baptist, okay, was danced away into a martyr's grave. Salome, the daughter of the wife of Herod, danced for Herod. Herod said, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Salome asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. Okay. So why does he only crave for John the Baptist? Because John the Baptist's face was on the florin, the unit of money, the coin. Notice what Dante's saying. The Pope only lives for what? Money. And he says, I don't care about Paul or Peter. He's supposed to be the vicar of Christ. He's supposed to be the representative of Peter. Okay? Talk about dangerous language. So, Canto 19. The eagle speaks. And Dante says, line 7, what I must now relate was ne'er with ink written or told in speech, nor by the powers of mine e'er grasped to imagine it or think. For I beheld and heard that beak discourse. In other words, I heard an eagle speak, and utter with its voice both mine and me, when in conception still 'twas us and ours. And so it talks about justice and piety. The reason it's an eagle is because an eagle is an emblem of the empire. And this is all part of what Sayers has talked about in the introductions about, part of the allegory being about the city/empire. Because Dante he's a true imperialist. He believes in the empire because the empire is symbolic of the authority and the power and the hierarchy of God. The emperor stands in place of God. He is God's vice regent. The whole idea of the divine right of kings and such. Okay? Don't have to agree with it. It's just what's there. So it keeps speaking, line 25. Now with your breathing errors, this is Dante speaking to the eagle, with your breathing errors, allay the dearth I've suffered long, by hunger hard assailed, because I found no food for it on earth. Well know I, if God's justice is beheld among these spheres out here, in any mirror glass, yours above all must gaze on it unveiled. How eagerly I wait the truth at last, and what it is I never have understood. Ye know, with all the cause of my long fast. What is it Dante wants to know? Question regarding divine justice. And what's the question? Why does God punish noble pagans who never heard of Christ? Why do they go to hell? Limbo. Okay? "40, the eagle speaks. He that with turning compass drew the world's confines, that is, God as the divine architect, and traced there such largesse of things, all different, seen or hid from view, all different, all the varieties, all the many different kinds of things that God created, whether seen or hidden, could not on all that universe impress his worth, so holy, but that his words must still remain in infinite excess." He couldn't pour all of himself down on it. There would still be infinite excess because God is limitless. He's unbounded. "Witness that first proud being," that is, take as witness, that first proud being made so bright he topped creation. Lucifer, Satan. Lucifer means light bearer, son of the morning stars, how he's referred to. The morning star is Christ. Son of the morning star, he's the highest of the angelic beings. Okay? Yet he fell anon unripe, because he would not wait for light. Now, what Dante is suggesting here, and this must be medieval Catholic doctrine, is that if Lucifer had been patient, he would have come to know more. I don't think it taught, medieval Catholic doctrine, taught that Lucifer would ever have become like God or as high as God. He can't. Logically, he can't because he's created, God is uncreated. Okay? He fell unripe, unripened. He wasn't yet what he could have become in time, because he would not wait for light. That is, he would not wait to receive more light. See, and I think what Dante is suggesting is that the angelic beings, like human beings, were designed to be filled with more and more and more glory from God. And as eternity goes on, they get more and more and more glory. Okay? Because God can never entirely give out all his glory. because his glory has no ending. It could also be a reference to Adam as the highest of earthly beings who didn't wait, okay? Showing, that is, witness showing. So look at, and this is what it means, that lesser natures, all and one, from Lucifer all the way down to subatomic particles, are two straight vessels for that good which stays boundless. They're too straight. That is, they're bounded. They are circumscribed. God is uncircumscribed. So whatever God pours into a circumscribed being, okay, it's got to become more and measured by itself alone. So God creates humanity. Why? So that humanity can become like God, like him. It can't help but do that, essentially. Our sight, which must be one among the rays of that great mind which fills all creatures full. So our sight comes from God's mind, can never then, by nature of the case, because it's given by God, possess such power, but that its principle must penetrate beyond it and perceive far more than to your eyes is visible. Our sight, which comes directly from God, can perceive more than your sight can. All right? So we can perceive deeper into God's mind. Such vision, then, as you on earth receive, drowns in eternal justice evermore. Eternal justice. Eternal means what? Without end. But he uses the language drowns. Why? Because he's going to use the metaphor of the sea. Eternal justice is like an ocean whose bottom is depthless. Like sight in ocean whelmed beyond retrieve. Okay? For a while it sees the bottom near the shore, go to the beach, step a few inches into the water, and you can see the shore. Keep walking out, and after a while, you can't see the shore anymore. In the great main, the deepness of the ocean, the bottom's not to be seen. But it's there. It is there. The deep, the ocean, has sealed it over. In other words, God's justice kind of does have a bottom. I don't think he means that literally, because he's using the metaphor of the ocean. The ocean does have a bottom, but it can't be seen. Similarly, God's justice, human sight cannot perceive its depth. So, now, line 67. Now is sufficiently made manifest, that is clear to your vision, the maze, wherein that living justice hid for which thou madest such persistent quest. It's like, Dante, you're standing, like, Dante, you're standing here and you need to get down here, but you can't see through all these corners of the maze. Right? You can't perceive that. For here's a man thou saidst, and so the eagle, the characters in the eagle speaking, the souls in the eagle speaking, say, here's an example. You say there's this guy over on the Indian Ganges River, or on the bank of the Indus River. Good person, doesn't know anything about Christ. Line 73, he lives, as far as we can tell, quite well, rightly disposed, doesn't behave amiss, blameless in word and deed, yet he's infidel, not a Christian, and unbaptized he dies. Tell me this. Where's the justice that condemns the man for unbelief? What fault is it of his? That's your question, right, Dante? The 5 ask him, 6, I think it is. Notice their response. Who art thou to be a judge? and scan truth, scan, oversee, to look at and evaluate truth from thy bench 1,000 miles away, who with thy short sight that carries but a span. A span is your arm stretched out, fingertip to fingertip. What are they saying? Dante, you're myopic. You are nearsighted. You can't see beyond your fingertips. How do you think you're going to see? How did they put it? 1,000 miles away. Had ye no rule of scripture well a day, he'd find, who subtly went to work with me, find puzzles there to keep his wits in play. O minds of earth, O clods, it ne'er could be that primal will, first will, God's will, good in itself, should quit it very self, of good the a per se. That is, it cannot be that God's will, which is in and of itself good, should be ungood, should be evil. Right, right, line 88. So far as this with that doth fit, that is, as long as God's justice fits with his will, then his justice is good. No finite good draws that, God's justice, to its own measure. You cannot compare God's justice to your sense of justice. Why? Because your sense of justice is like a scratch in the earth. God's justice is like the distance from here to the end of the universe. Doesn't compare. But that, by raying forth God's justice, by shining down to us, gives rise to it. That is, our notion of justice is what? It's like using this phone as a mirror. Okay? What kind of mirror is that? You hold the book over here. It's not a very good one, is it? It's dim. Well, our notion of justice is a dim, almost parody of divine justice. As St. Paul says, we see but through a glass darkly here, right? But we have a notion of justice. C.S. Lewis calls this in his book, Mere Christianity, the Tao. It's the way. And what he means by that is all cultures everywhere on earth, how do we know there's a real standard of justice? Because we all have a sense of fairness, fair play. There's never been a culture that's written about, that has a history, etc., that doesn't have a notion of something being fair or unfair. The very fact that there is this universal condition or idea of fairness implies there is something beyond us that gives us that idea. It's the same idea of, we can't talk about, this life sucks without some idea of there being a better life. If this is all there is, then you couldn't say, well, it sucks, because that compares to something, right? So it goes on, line 97. My song outspans thy mortal wit, surpassing all thou knowest. That is, I know you don't understand what I'm getting at, Dante. So doth the eternal judgment matched with man's. Okay? In other words, it's beyond our ability. He's not saying it's not our right. He's saying it's beyond our ability to even question divine justice and judgment. So the voice goes on, line 103. Let me back up. 100. When these bright ardors of the Holy Ghost resettled, and that standard's form restored, which once made Rome revered from coast to coast, well, the eagle was the emblem of Rome. The voice began again. None ever soared to this high realm that had not faith in Christ ere he was nailed on tree or afterward. None ever arrived up here in heaven who did not have faith in Christ before he was crucified. So nobody who died before Christ rose to heaven. Or nobody who lived before, let me put it this way, who lived before Christ went to heaven until he was crucified. My one quibble there would be, what about Enoch and Elijah? Enoch walked with God and was no more, we're told in the Old Testament. Elijah was taken up in the fiery chariot. Taken up where? Where did Enoch walk to? The traditional understanding is they were taken up to heaven. Okay? This is part of medieval Catholic doctrine. It's not the teaching of the Eastern Orthodox by any means, and I don't think it's not the teaching of Protestantism either. I used to be card-carrying Reformed Protestant. Okay, so, but see line 106. Full many shall cry aloud, Christ, Christ, who in the last day shall be sent to lodge farther from him than they who knew not Christ. It's the parable of the Last Judgment, Matthew 25. Christ says, many will come to me and will say, Lord, Lord, and I'll say, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. Why? Because when I was hungry, when I was thirsty, when I was naked, when blah, 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 you didn't comfort me. Okay? But he also says in that parable, many will come to him that will be sent to his right hand, and they will say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? When did we see you naked and clothe you? When did we see you thirsty and give you food? When were you in prison and we visited you? And he says, inasmuch as you've done it unto the least of these, you did it unto me. Which many people take, Orthodox and now Catholic and some Protestant, take to mean that there will be many people in heaven who did not, quote unquote, know Christ while they were on earth. That is, they were not Christians. But they did those things. And Christ said, because you did it to each other, I took it as you're doing it unto me. Why? Because each person bears the divine image of Christ. So, Christians like these, the Ethiop shall judge. He's not using Ethiop because the Ethiopian is black. He means the Ethiop because the Ethiopian doesn't know Christ. Even though Ethiopia did have one of the earliest Christian communities. When part the flocks to taste the wealth that springs eternal, or chew the eternal empty grudge. Okay? So that's the answer to, Dante's question. Canto 20. Let's see here. So in Canto 20, we get the identification of who the souls are in the eagle's head. Okay? And the pupil, the eye of the eagle, is David, king of Israel, psalmist, he's referred to, line 38, as the minstrel of the Holy Spirit. Okay. On the eyebrow, closest to the beak, is the Emperor Trajan. And you've got a comment there, who consoled the widow when her son was slain. And you got a note in the back, there's a story about Trajan. He was getting ready to go off to war, and a poor widow came up to him and begged for his assistance because her son was slain, and he kind of put off the campaign and helped her and such. He's described as being a good person, a great king and such. There's an apocryphal kind of story given, I think it is in the life of St. Gregory the Great, that Gregory, would see Trajan's column all the time in Rome and was so moved by him and by the stories of him that he prayed for him. And he prayed for him. I think this is recounted in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. He prayed for him, and he prayed that God would allow Trajan to come back to life for an hour, or have his life come back for an hour so that he could know Christ and then die. And he does. God kind of, takes him back in time, so to speak, brings him back to life. Trajan is convinced of the truth of the gospel, becomes a Christian, then dies. The important thing about that is you have an instance there of somebody's prayers bringing somebody out of hell. Okay, there's a 20th century saint named Saint Silouan, a Russian saint on Mount Athos, who used to pray with tears, according to his disciple, prayed with tears for Satan and the fallen angels. He would pray for their redemption, pray for their, salvation and such. Anyways, so you have Trajan, you got mention of his time in limbo, of this sweet life and of the opposite. Then you have Hezekiah mentioned, beginning with line 49. Hezekiah, Old Testament king, on his deathbed, he asks God for more time. God gives him 15 years. Okay. Constantine, who's, Dante's kind of a little bit ambivalent about, because it's Constantine who split the empire into two. Left Rome, built Constantinople where Byzantium was, modern day Istanbul, and gave Rome at the time to Pope Sylvester to rule. In the fraudulent document called the Donation of Constantine, which kind of says, the Pope can have temporal as well as spiritual rule, and thus the church-state problem. Okay. Let's see. And then the last person mentioned is Trojan Ripaeus, okay, who we're told believed before he died. Line 70, and now he knows the grace of God and sees much that the world is powerless to describe, the sounding not its last profundities. Okay. Bottom of page 234. So, the eagle says to Dante, I see thou dost believe because I say that these things are. The how escapes thy sight. That is, you want to know, how does this happen? So they'll believe they're hid, and thou dost say, like one who knows a thing by name aright, yet of its quiddity makes no pretense to knowledge till some other give him light. Its quiddity, its essence, its substance, okay? Its isness, all right? That is, you, Dante, don't presume to know what its isness, what its essence is. Line 94, regnum coelorum suffereth violence. Regnum coelorum, that's kingdom of heaven, suffereth violence. Why? Matthew 11:12. Christ says the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Regnum coelorum suffereth violence from ardent love and living hope, which still conquer God's will and beat down his defense. Prayers, okay? Christ tells the parable of the old woman who, harasses the judge essentially and says it's her prayer that beats him down. Line 97, however, not as man beats down man. That's physical beating down. Himself, that is God, doth will to suffer conquest. God desires people to pray to him for what? For mercy for others. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Notice, thy will be done here as it is in heaven, and forgive us as we forgive others. That's kind of saying God desires for us to forgive others, and he won't forgive us until we forgive others. Who by his own love conquered, comes conquering and unconquerable. Notice, this is a mystery. It's a paradox. Right? So he talks about the brow, and he talks about repayus. He says, line 102, no, these put the body off, not Gentiles. Talk about Trajan and repayus. Not Gentiles as thou deemest, but complete in Christian faith, clinging as each had scope to the passion pierced, to the yet to be passable feet. Yet to be passable. Why? Passable means sufferable, because they hadn't yet been born. They clung in faith to one to whom they did not know about. For one from hell, where spirits never grow back to right will, into his flesh and bone returned. This was the guerdon, the reward of living hope. The living hope that nerved the orison, that is the prayers of Gregory, made unto God to raise him up, and dower his will once more with motion, to endow his will once more with motions of its own. Which glorious soul, Trajan's, when for a little while it thus resumed the body whence it came, believed on him that hath the saving power. And so believing, loved, with ardent flame so bright that at the second death, 'twas found worthy to join our high celestial game. The other, repayus, who lived centuries before Trajan, as he was a Trojan, by grace from such deep ground gushing that no created eye can plumb its hidden wealth brings where they run profound, on righteousness spent all his earthly sum of love. In other words, repayus practiced grace, whence God from grace to grace unsealed his eyes to the redemption yet to come. Because of repayus's way of life, God, before repayus's death, showed him the future Christ. Then he, believing in the truth revealed, the stench of pagan felt the more could bear, and scourged the vice with which the land was filled, ere ever baptism was, 1,000 years he was baptized. Not literally baptized, spiritually baptized. That is, he died spiritually in Christ so that he could rise spiritually in Christ. Predestination, line 130. What far depths conceal from feeble sight, unable to detect the first cause whole, the entirety of God, thy root of woe and weal. Notice, our feeble sight cannot perceive that. Line 133, and mortals, keep your judgment straightly checked. Keep it in bounds. For here we see God face to face. Here, not down here on earth. up there in heaven. We see God face to face, and still we know not all the roll of his elect. We don't know who all is going to be saved. We don't know if it's only Christians. Okay? Yet sweet to us appears our lack of skill, since this good doth our good the more refine. This good, God. And what else is the good? That what God willeth, that we also will. God purifies their good and their will, and what God wills, they also will. Okay? 21. Dante looks towards Beatrice, and his eyes fix on her. She was unsmiling and says, were I to smile, her words began, thou wouldst become the same as simile, burned to an ashy pile. They now rise to the heaven of Saturn. In other words, if I were to smile, Dante, you'd be consumed. The experience would overwhelm his senses. For as thou knowest, with a brighter flame as we ascend the eternal mansion stair, a ladder of divinity, so to speak, my beauty's splendor glows. If, as we came, its radiance were untempered, in other words, my radiance, Dante, is shadowed now. Okay? It's hidden from you. Thy mortal power as a thunderbolt will smite the foliage from branch and leave it bare. You'd be killed. Okay? Because what else happens up there? They're now on the golden ladder. They make their way up. And Dante asks, why don't I hear music? I've heard music. I've heard singing in these other spheres. Line 46. But she whose sign I heed, that is, she's a sign and a symbol to me, and I note it, I follow it, I pay attention to it. Of how and when to speak and to keep silent, now is still. Rightly, therefore, from asking, I refrain, because she doesn't indicate, go ahead and ask. Dante says, I shut up. Then she, my silence being visible, within the sight of him who sees all things, God, she says, ask away. So Dante says, why in the region of this wheel no strains of heavenly symphony arise, as through the other spheres devoutly peal? Why don't I hear the music? 61. Thou hast but mortal ears, even as thine eyes, the answer came. Hence we forbear to sing, as Beatrice forbears to smile likewise. Okay? What? If you were to hear us, you would die. Down by thy holy ladder steps I wing, my way thus far solely to pleasure thee with converse and my soul's bright mentally. I'm not here to rapture you, I'm here to talk with you. Nor may my swift descent the measure be of greater love, equal and more above, thou seest love sparkle in this treasury. What you've seen below, you're going to see even more of up above. But the deep charity which bids us move to serve the council governing mankind assigns our office as thine eyes can prove. So this soul comes down and speaks to him and says, I've kind of been sent to speak to you. Dante says, why? Why were you chosen? Out of all the souls that are here, why you? And the speaker says, line 82. Well, line 82. The love that dwelt therein replied anew. That is, this soul, bearing directly on me is God's light, piercing the bowel of my being through. That is, it fills me entirely. Its power being then conjoined to my sight, lifts me above myself, until I gaze upon his essence, whence is milked such might. It's like milk is like milk from a nipple is dripping from God's essence. Thence, from the might, comes the joyfulness wherewith I gaze. My sight's intensity these sparkling show, thus flame with vision in the balance weighs. And yet that soul who doth most brightly go, that seraph fixed on God with peerless might, could not discern the answer thou wouldst know. In other words, not even the highest of the seraphim in the presence of God, not even that seraph could answer your question. Why? Doesn't know the answer. The thing thou asks is plunged so deep in the night of the eternal statutes' dark abyss, it is cut off from all created sight. No matter what the level of the created being, can never plunge that deep into the abyss that is God. God is ultimately totally unknowable unless God reveals himself. In his essence, totally unknowable. Okay? He manifests himself. And to the mortal world, line 97, take thou back this. So, when you go back to your body and you write your little poem, make sure you include this, Dante. Let men aim lower and no more presume to encroach on these exalted mysteries. See, the schoolmen, the philosophers of the church, Thomas Aquinas, was one. They tried to delve into all kinds of questions. They tried to answer all questions rationally. And the speaker is saying, this is Peter Damian, by the way. He is saying, stop. Stop. Don't go beyond what you're capable of understanding. Okay? In the Eastern Church, for example, what the Western Church calls sacraments, the Eastern Church calls mysteries. Why? Because we don't really totally intellectually understand what is happening there. For example, the Eucharist. In the Western Church, at the point when the priest says, in a Catholic Church, says, if he's saying it in Latin, hoc est corpus, this is my body, broken for you. This is my blood, shed for you and for the life of many, for the redemption of the world. He calls the Holy Spirit down. In the Middle Ages, Catholic theologians, Thomas Aquinas, created a term to describe what happens at that point. That term is transubstantiation. Why? Because the substance of what is used for what's called the host in the Eucharistic meal, what is initially bread and wine, is transubstantiated. It is changed across into what? This is my body. That is, the substance, according to transubstantiation, the substance of the bread becomes the actual physical flesh of Christ, but the accidents, its appearance, still looks like bread. The substance of the wine is transubstantiated into the actual physical blood of Christ. Its accidents, what it appears to be, what it looks like, if you were to put it under a microscope, it would look like wine, okay? In the Eastern Church, we do say that when the priest calls down the Holy Spirit and asks for the Holy Spirit to make this bread the precious body of thy Christ, and to make this blood the precious blood of thy Christ, we accept through faith that that's what happens. That when we take the Eucharist, we are eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. We are bringing that divinity into us. We don't know how, and we don't presume to know how, and we don't want to know how. Okay? That's kind of what he's getting at. Don't delve too deeply. The mind, which here, up there in heaven, in the presence of God, is a light, on earth is fume, smoke, like gasoline fumes, right? How can it there, down on earth, discern what even now, up here in heaven, is hid? Though heaven, it to itself assume, though the body were to go up into heaven. He's saying, stop. You can't understand this. And that's when Dante says, who are you? Okay? End of the passage. Canto. After Peter Damian says who he is, line 127. Previous stanza, he mentions he was made a cardinal. He does it metaphorically. Talked about dragged into the hat, meaning the cardinal's hat. Line 127. Barefoot and lean came Cephas, Peter, came the great vessel of the Holy Ghost, and they would sup at whatsoever house they halted at, meaning they were itinerants. They wandered. Peter did not have a home once he started following Christ. Pastors today, priests, bishops, archbishops, cardinals, popes, required to be propped up on either side. One man their horse, two lead, so great their weight, because they're fat. And one their train to loop. Over their mounts their mantles fall, that is, their clothing is so large, not because of their fatness, but it covers over their horses. Full spread, two beasts beneath one hide, behold them go. O patience, is thy meekness not yet fled? I think that, O patience, is thy meekness not yet fled, doesn't give a gloss. I think that's an allusion to the souls in the book of Revelation under the altar, crying out, how long, O Lord, how long? In other words, when are you going to return? How long must we cry out? Upon these words, more lights appeared below from rung to rung. I saw them whirl and spin, and every circling made their beauty grow. Clustered about this light, they uttered then a cry so loud I can relate no more. So greatly it surpassed all mortal din, and Dante swoons amid the roar. Again, I think it's not calling for vengeance, okay? It's referring to God's patience. We're told God, in the scriptures, God desires the death of no man. He wills that all men come to the knowledge of Christ, etc. Is thy meekness, in other words, come on, God, you're holding your power back. That's what meekness is. Meekness is you have the power to do something, but you don't do it. Come on. It's time. Okay? All right, we will, let's see. We've done 2.5, a little over 2.5 hours. Yeah, we'll stop there, and I'll do the last lecture over the weekend.